So the Darksiders series in general were the type of games you would always seem to spot on game store shelves, but this one in particular seemed to be everywhere. Every time I walked into a GameStop, Best Buy, or some independent game store, there would always be several copies of this game staring at me to buy them. Maybe it was just the stores buying me, but for whatever reason, this stayed rotting on shelves. Don't know why, because everyone I know that's played this fucks with it. It seems to be the consensus best game in the series by fans too. And yeah, after replaying this game for this vid, I think I'm in agreement. Have to replay the third game again just to make sure, but compared to the first game, yeah, this is an improvement on all fronts. They already had something solid with Darksiders 1, so refinement was a no-brainer, but making this into an action RPG? Yeah, that took some cojones. Well, actually, I guess not, since straight-up God of War hack-and-slash games were already going out of style, but nonetheless, it was a wise decision because we ended up with a better game. We'll get into the whys later. For now, who the hell is this? This ain't War, this sure as shit ain't Earth in the first game. What the hell is going on here? So Darksiders 2 takes place concurrently with Darksiders 1, particularly that time where War was framed and imprisoned for 100 years. With him out of action, we play as another horseman in Death, War's brother who seeks to absolve War by restoring humanity. He first tries to do this by visiting some dude named the Crowfather, who apparently has answers, but the two soon rumble over Death refusing to take this amulet from him. Death whoops his ass, but before dying, he embeds the fragments of the amulet in his chest and sends him packing in a portal. Death awakens in the Forge Lands, a realm home of these giant dwarf-looking people called the Makers, who are like the blacksmiths of the universe. There's only a few of them left though, due to this dark force called corruption, ravaging everything. It's even blocked off the Tree of Life, which is where Death needs to go to complete his mission. So with similar goals overlapping, Death assists the Makers in restoring their forge and fighting off the corruption. The tasks aren't so straightforward though, as my guy gets transported into different realms and gets caught up in all types of shit.
Thanks for the warning.
So Joe Mads and the rest of the team's over-the-top grand fantasy art style is still present and still rules, but it does look a little bit more cartoony this time around. It's subtle, but the colors of the environments and characters are a bit more vibrant, and the characters look a bit more rounded out, for a lack of a better term. Despite being the fucking Grim Reaper, Death looks and comes across as less menacing than his brother War. He looks like a damn reskin of Spawn. Not that that's a bad thing, makes sense considering where Joe Mad got his start. Hopping around different realms and not being stuck on the destroyed Earth does allow for even more variety in the look of the levels. There's plenty of locales in this one that have a pleasant vibe to them and are not so grim, dark, apocalyptic. Look at this, pastures of green, you gotta love it, at least you know, until you go to hell. The Kingdom of the Dead is where things do get a bit homogenous with back-to-back undead tombs in a row. Fits thematically, but these shits were like a whole third of the game and boy did it get tiring to look at. Not really much else to say about the look of this game though. I mean, it's the first game but a bit cleaner. Still metal as fuck and looks like a high-budget indie game that could be released today. Same with the voice acting, which still sounds badass. The cast here ain't as star-studded as the first game, but it doesn't matter because all the voices still have that gravitas and the dialogue is well written.
So, the Charred Council sends only one horseman, even to the past. No, this visit is unsanctioned. In fact, no one knows you're here.
Not so. I hand over the key, it can be our little secret.
And then we got the music, which I actually noticed this time around. Looking at who composed this time around, yeah, it's no wonder. We actually got some epic tunes with some grand strings, balanced with some more soothing ambience for the slower moments.
And what of war? Would you kill your brother to save your precious balance?
He is innocent.
Are you so certain?
Unfortunately, all the improvements with the art and vibe did not go into the performance. How the fuck do you remaster a game and have it run worse? If you buy this shit on PC, be prepared to deal with bugs. I'm talking about the game randomly crashing, sometimes not starting, inputs not inputting, and all other types of random shit. If you go on Steam and browse through all the negative reviews, you'll notice that practically all of the complaints are directed towards the bugs. Nobody really has a problem with the actual game. It's the fact that it can't run without some extra tinkering. Managed to avoid most of the bullshit by just playing the PlayStation 5 version, but even here my game would randomly crash from time to time with some other weird glitches. Maybe Vigil was pressed for time or something. Making a game this big in only 2 years for every platform at the time is pretty crazy. I just know that crunch was nasty. So if you come from Darksiders 1, it doesn't take too long playing to notice that things are pretty damn different here. The damage numbers on screen aren't just for show. You actually got to pay attention to keep up with stats this time around, and that's because along with the hacking and slashing, there's levels, color-coded gear, a skill tree, and more. The Blizzard influences in the first game were minor, but there is no ignoring it here. The way I feel about this sort of color-coded gear system here is how I feel about it everywhere. Stopping after every fight to scan over some gear starts to get annoying as shit. However, there is a part of my lizard brain that lights up when I do run into some gear that provides better numbers. I guess it equals out, but I do feel like just getting good at the combat, along with slowly acquiring new abilities throughout the skill tree, is good enough for that feeling of progression. Especially since there's a lot more going on with the combat now. Apparently Death is the oldest and strongest of the 4 horsemen, and yeah, you feel that shit. You got a lot more to work with here, and Death in general feels way better to control than War. Longer combos, more special abilities that flow into the combos, faster and more fluid animations, and oh my god, a dodge that isn't so damn stiff and you can string together. Pretty much everything I had a problem with the combat in Darksiders 1 has been rectified. Everything that I already liked has been refined. The moment-to-moment action feels so much better this time around, and it just looks cooler too. There's so much shit happening on screen sometimes, and the movement is so loose that sometimes it can be hard keeping track of death. There's still some instant brutal finishes, but they don't come around as often, which I think was for the best. Not only for the series to have its own separate feel from God of War, but also those executions did get pretty repetitive in the first game and sort of halted your momentum in big ass group fights. The first game already had an impressive variety of enemies, and this game continues that tradition by introducing even more weird ass demons and angels that come in all types of shapes and sizes. Even in certain dungeons, this game isn't shy about keeping you guessing on what you're going to fight next, and it definitely does contribute to the combat staying fresh 15 hours in. Not all the enemies are winners though. These shield dudes are still incredibly unfun to fight against with their constant blocking, but there ain't too much of them. But even more than that, the bosses are super dope in this one. Still a lot of puzzle-like fights where you're trying to figure out the boss's weak spots and exploit the shit. However, the scale and epicness of these fights have definitely been turned up. The Guardian has to be an homage to Shadow of the Colossus. The design and how you take him down is way too familiar. Results in one of the best moments of the game, but even beyond that, there's more of an actual fight with these boss fights this time around, with them throwing out a bit more random attacks that you have to dodge and counter. A bit more of a back and forth, which is usually what I prefer in boss fights. But as we know, Darksiders isn't just the slicing and dicing. A large part of the gameplay loop is the dungeons and all the puzzle solving that goes on in them. And yeah, there's still plenty of that in Darksiders 2, way more of that. There's stopgaps in between areas that require you to stop and solve them, which I'm not gonna lie, some of this shit didn't need to be here, and it just felt like the game was padding itself out, which is one of the issues I have with this game that I'll touch on later. The puzzles themselves are still pretty good though, but there is more variance in the quality from puzzle to puzzle here compared to the first game. They play out the same in that you gain some special power from a dungeon and then utilize that power along with bombs, switches, levers to open the way forward. It's just that there's not really a slow escalation in terms of difficulty anymore. Like often, especially in the second half of the game, you'll get thrown some pretty elaborate puzzle that requires you to utilize several of your powers at once in weird ways, and then the next puzzle will just be some simple ass bullshit that ends up feeling like a distraction. The first game wasn't really like that. The puzzles in the beginning were simple, and then the later puzzles were appropriately more elaborate, as by this point you should understand how all your abilities work with each other. Here it just feels like the level designers just placed all the puzzles in these dungeons randomly, and it results in some pretty weird ass pacing. I would still say on average though, the dungeon quality is on par with the first game, and that's because the abilities themselves that they're centered around are a bit more interesting than anything found in the first game. Controlling these rock constructs that are essentially giant keys that can both whoop ass and get you to unreachable places, raising and controlling these undead lords that can phase through gates, which later turns into Death being able to split himself in two. Portals again, except this time you're going back and forth through time, which results in the Black Stone definitely being one of the coolest dungeons to traverse through. You're essentially traversing through two dungeons at once, and it's just super cool seeing the contrast between how put together this place was in the past versus how fucked up it is in the present. Yeah, they got pretty damn ambitious with these dungeons, not just with the tools used throughout, but the sheer size of them. Big ass fortresses with multiple floors and shit. These hallways reach far and wide, and oftentimes you're going pretty damn deep down one path only to backtrack way the hell back to the other side of the dungeon. It does make these places feel like these grand places that you're actually exploring, but man, there were so many times in this game where I was like,
this isn't even the right way!
Yeah, unlike the first game, I was pulling up walkthroughs for this. The way to go and what to do isn't very intuitive at times. The devs probably knew this too, which is why they added this bird companion named Dust, who you can ask to show you the way. I wouldn't rely on this though. Often this bird gets just as confused as you and will end up flying around in circles. Still, the dungeons are both bigger and better. You know what's bigger and not better? The open world. This is probably where I differ from people's opinions the most regarding this game. Making this game more open world was pretty unnecessary if you ask me. There's enemies scattered around to kill, and not much else. Maybe some loot and the odd side mini dungeon, but that's about it. There's not really much of an incentive to get lost in the world. No real interesting towns, characters, or crazy creatures to run into outside of the main quest. All four realms are barren as hell. There was no travel back from dungeons from me. I was abusing fast travel any chance I got. Can't help but feel like they used up all their world design juices with the first two kingdoms, as they're the only ones with actual zones and branching paths. The later ones are just one long path. I fuck with the actual dungeons in these zones, but it was at Lost Light where I was like, damn, this game is still going? How many quests are left? Yeah, just like the first game, they definitely could have trimmed this down a bit. The Earth sequence where this game turns into a third-person shooter, yeah, I don't know what that was about, but that could have been cut out completely. Many of the puzzles could have been shaved, and much of the stopgaps in between areas where you're just wandering around could have been cut too. It feels like Death's journey was arbitrarily extended simply because the motherfucker couldn't say no to people. Despite being this notorious harbinger of death, bro just ends up being everybody's errand boy. At least the interactions between him and the other characters are somewhat interesting. Actually having a menu of dialogue options does a lot in fleshing out the world. You can ask clarifying questions about specific things regarding the world and events, and it definitely makes it easier to be sucked into the story. It also helps that, the story in general is a bit more interesting this time around. Unlike his brother War, Death actually has emotions and a personality to speak of. Of course, he's badass and driven to keep the balance, but he's also witty as shit, and it's fun seeing him trying to get answers out of these cosmic entities.
Tell me about the king of the dead.
His reign is eternal, his word is law, and his time is invaluable. I ensure that he need only speak with those who are worthy.
Then you must rarely see him, Chancellor.
But even more than that, there's a personal internal struggle with him that's actually compelling to watch. The game reveals that the Horsemen were part of a race called the Nephilim that they had to slaughter in the name of keeping the balance. Death was the one that took lead, killing the leader Absalom, and even spared the souls of his brethren by locking him away in this amulet. With Absalom coming back as the cause of the corruption, facing it, in a way, is Death confronting his past, constantly wondering if what he did that day was the right thing to do. It's ironic too, because Death's whole quest in this game is to save a fellow Nephilim, despite the fact that, at least as far as he knows, was a threat to the balance. And this already makes the story in this one a bit more interesting than the first, as there's some actual personal stakes with the main character involved. But even beyond that, the world itself is a bit more interesting now, with backstories on the Nephilim, how the Four Horsemen came to be, the role of the Makers, and some further mystery regarding Samael and his motives. There's a bit more chess pieces on the board this time around, and it makes the game a bit more exciting. Unfortunately, this game takes place simultaneously with Darksiders 1, which means that most of what was set up here has yet to be resolved. The third game is yet another sidequel focused on a specific horseman with no fourth entry in sight, but I guess I'll talk more about that in the next vid.
Let me tell you something.
So yeah, that's Darksiders 2. Yeah, this game is just as good as I remember. An improvement over the first game in most regards, and honestly a pretty underrated game in the grand scheme of things. There's a lot to like here, man. Badass combat, well-designed dungeons, cool puzzles, and some narrative beats worth a damn. Turning the series into an action RPG was a pretty natural progression looking back on it. I know quite a bit of people where this is the only one in the trilogy that they really fuck with. I'm not one of them, as I like all three games in their own ways, but there's no doubt in my mind that this is better than the first. Anyway, that's all I gotta say about this. If you like this video, do all the things to boost it in the algorithm, and I'll see y'all next time.